welcome back. Today, we're jumping into an incredible story, one of faith, power, and culture that kicked off in the Arabian desert and, well, ended up shaping the entire world. So, yeah, that's the big question, right? How does that happen? It's a pretty wild journey, from just one voice to a whole global civilization. All right, let's get into it. Okay, so to really get how Islam took off, we have to rewind a bit. We need to look at the world it came from and, of course, the life of its founder, Muhammad. All right, I want you to picture this. We're in 7th century Arabia. It's this huge desert landscape, a place the Roman Empire, for all its power, never actually managed to conquer. It's mostly home to these nomadic tribes, moving with their animals, and they worshipped a whole bunch of different gods. But it wasn't all just sand. You also had these busy trading cities, and the real hub, the most important one, was Mecca. And Mecca is exactly where Muhammad is born, around the year 570. He grows up, becomes a merchant, and then in 610, everything changes. He says he received a message, a direct revelation from God brought by an angel. Now, he starts sharing these messages, but let's just say the powerful folks in Mecca were not fans of his growing influence. Things got so tense that in 622, he and his followers had to leave. They migrated to the city of Medina. This move, called the Hijra, was so important, so foundational, that it actually marks year 1 on the Islamic calendar. So what was this message all about? Well, the absolute heart of it was monotheism, the belief in one and only one God, who in Arabic is called Allah. And what's super interesting here is that this wasn't totally out of left field for the region. This new faith shared a common ancestor with Judaism and Christianity, the prophet Abraham. Yeah, so in this new faith, prophets you've probably heard of, like Moses and Jesus, were still seen as incredibly important and respected. But Muhammad was considered the final messenger, the seal of the prophets, the last and most important one in that long line. And all those revelations he got over his lifetime, they were eventually collected and written down in the holy book we know as the Quran. But this new faith, it wasn't just about what you believed in your head. It was more like a blueprint for how to live your life, how to build a whole community. And it was all built around 5 central key practices. These are the famous 5 pillars, and they really became the bedrock of the entire Muslim community. And the thing is, they weren't just private individual duties. I mean, yeah, declaring your faith or praying 5 times a day is personal, but so much of it was about shared public action. Things like required charity, fasting together during Ramadan, and especially that massive pilgrimage to Mecca. All of these things were absolutely crucial in bringing all these different Arab peoples together into one unified community. And that unity, it became an incredibly powerful force. After Muhammad's death, the whole story shifts gears. We're about to enter a new phase, one of absolutely explosive expansion, but also one that leads to a deep, lasting division. So, Muhammad dies in 632, and the leadership passes to a series of successors known as caliphs. And these guys weren't just religious leaders, they were political leaders too. The second caliph, a man named Omar, was apparently a military genius. Under his command, Arab armies just swept across the Middle East, conquering massive territories at a speed that was, frankly, astonishing. Just to give you a sense of the scale here, get this. By the year 732, that's only 100 years after Muhammad's death, the Islamic Empire stretched from what is now Pakistan all the way across North Africa and into Spain. Its push into Western Europe was only stopped that year way deep inside what we now call France. But while the empire is getting bigger and bigger, a really critical conflict is starting to brew right at its heart. A power struggle breaks out, and a question that had been kind of bubbling under the surface for a while finally explodes into the open. Who is the rightful successor? Who really has the right to lead the entire Muslim community? And this is where the big split happens. It basically came down to this. One group, who we now know as the Sunnis, said, okay, the leadership of this powerful family, the Umayyads, is legitimate. But another group completely disagreed. They believed the leader had to be a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad himself. They backed his son-in-law, Ali, and this group became known as the Shiites. And that fundamental disagreement over who should lead, that's what created the Sunni-Shia split, a division that, as you know, is still incredibly significant in the world today. Okay, so even while all this political drama and division is happening, something else is going on. The empire itself is entering this absolutely remarkable era of cultural and scientific flourishing that we often call the Islamic Golden Age. The new capital was first set up in Damascus, and then later another dynasty moved it to the legendary city of Baghdad. And in these amazing cities, you had this explosion of knowledge. Scholars were taking all the wisdom from the peoples they'd conquered, translating ancient Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic. This just lit a fire under advances in science, medicine, mathematics, you name it. This was a seriously sophisticated empire, even sending diplomats to talk with leaders like Emperor Charlemagne way over in Europe. So you might be wondering, what about the people who already lived in these conquered lands? Well, because of those shared roots with Abraham, Jews and Christians were given a special status. They were called people of the book. Generally, they weren't forced to convert to Islam. That said, they were definitely a protected but still second-class group. They had to live under special rules, pay an extra tax, and they faced certain restrictions, like not being able to build new churches or synagogues. And that kind of brings our whirlwind tour to a close. It's an incredible story, right? From a single message in the desert to a globe-spanning empire. Its legacy isn't just in history books. It's woven into the very fabric of our world today, which leaves us with a big question to think about. How does this 1,400-year-old story of faith, expansion, and culture still shape our world, our politics, and our lives right now? Hey, if this got you thinking, do us a favor and hit that like button. And of course, subscribe for more. We would genuinely love to hear your thoughts on that final question down in the comments. Thanks so much for watching. So, have you ever really thought about what happens when a massive, powerful empire just vanishes? Today, we're diving deep into the early Middle Ages to see how society had to completely reinvent itself. And we're not talking about kings and queens, but about how ordinary people on the ground figured out how to survive. I want you to picture it. It's around the year 500. The Western Roman Empire, the superpower that had connected the whole world with roads, trade, and laws for centuries, it's gone. So what happens next? What on earth fills that huge power vacuum? Well, that question leads us to one of the biggest shifts in European history. You see, the fall of Rome wasn't just some date in a history book. For the people actually living through it, it was a terrifying new reality. All the structures, all the things that provided safety and stability for generations, they were just gone. And that plunged Western Europe into a really dangerous and uncertain time. Yeah, this collapse created this awful domino effect. Without the Roman armies, bandits and raiders could just roam free. Trade routes, they completely crumbled. And without trade, what happens? The great cities emptied out. So for your average farmer, life suddenly became incredibly dangerous. The old world was just replaced by one thing: total uncertainty. But here's the thing about people. We're resilient. And out of all that chaos, a totally new system started to take shape. It wasn't some grand, top-down plan from an emperor. Nope, it was local. It was all about survival. This was the birth of what we call the medieval domain, or the manor. At the end of the day, it all came down to a really simple but powerful bargain. You had a local strongman, a lord with his own soldiers, who could offer a shield against all the dangers of the world. And in exchange for that protection, peasants, who really just wanted to survive and feed their families, would work the lord's land. That one deal, it became the bedrock of a whole new society. And this system has a name. It's called the Hofstelsel, or as we usually say in English, the manorial system. The best way to think of it is like a self-contained bubble. Everything you needed for life, food, clothes, tools, and most importantly, safety, was all produced right there on the domain. The world kind of turned inward, and it became all about being self-sufficient. So let's try to put ourselves in their shoes for a second. If you were a farmer back in, say, the 7th century, you faced this life-altering choice. It was a trade-off that is pretty hard for us to even wrap our heads around today. No, seriously, think about it. What would you choose? Would you try to hold on to your freedom, own your own little plot of land, but live with the constant threat of starving or being attacked by raiders? Or would you trade that freedom for the safety of a lord's protection, even if it meant you were basically giving up control over your own life? So you basically had two paths you could take. On the one hand, you could be a free peasant, or a free boer. You own your land, you make your own choices, but you are completely on your own if trouble comes. On the other hand, you could become a serf, a horehabur. You don't own the land, you live on the Lord's land, you owe him rent, you owe him labor, but you and your family are safe, you're protected. And for a lot of people, that security was the only choice that made sense.
All right, so what did one of these self-sufficient little worlds actually look like? Come on, let's take a quick tour of a typical domain and see how all the pieces fit together.
Okay, so right at the heart of it all, you have the manor, the lord's big, fortified house. That's the center of power. Nearby, you'd find the workshops, the mill for grinding grain, the brewery, the weaver. All of these were owned by the lord, and peasants had to pay him to use them. Of course, you'd have a church, which was absolutely central to medieval life. Surrounding all of that were the farmlands, where everyone worked. And then you had something really, really important, the common lands. These woeste grond, or wild lands, were absolutely essential. These weren't neatly plowed fields, they were shared resources for the whole community. This is where you'd go to get wood for your fire and for building. It's where you let your animals graze. And it's where you'd find extra food, like berries and herbs. This land was the community's safety net. It was crucial for survival. So we've seen how the domain worked on a small, local level. Now let's just zoom out for a minute to really understand the huge, long-term impact this system had on everything. And here's the big takeaway. The manorial system wasn't just a new way to farm. It was a complete and total replacement for the old Roman way of life. That vital link between the city and the countryside, between trade and farming, it was severed. Society was fundamentally rebuilt from the ground up, all around the ideas of land and local self-sufficiency. This quote just sums it up perfectly. The new rules of the game weren't money and contracts anymore. They were land, which was the source of all wealth, and loyalty, that personal bond between a peasant and their lord. And that simple formula would define life in Europe for hundreds of years. And, that leaves us with one final, much bigger question. The story of the domain gives us one answer. When everything collapses, societies often turn inward. They prioritize local security and just plain survival above everything else. It's a pretty powerful reminder of how human communities find ways to adapt and keep going, even in the toughest times imaginable. If this explainer helped you understand the medieval world a little better, we'd really appreciate it if you like, subscribe, and maybe leave a comment below. Thanks so much for watching.
Hey there, and welcome. Today we are digging into one of history's most creative and, frankly, messiest systems for running a country, feudalism. It was this really clever solution for managing a huge and chaotic medieval Europe, especially when a king just couldn't do it all by himself. So, to really get it, let's first understand the massive problem these kings were staring down.
Right, so to figure out why feudalism was even a thing, you gotta picture Europe in the early Middle Ages. The Roman Empire had just crumbled, and with it, any kind of central control. It just evaporated. And that left kings with a truly massive headache.
So, I want you to put yourself in the king's shoes for a second. You are in charge of this gigantic territory. You've got to collect taxes, you've got to defend your borders, you have to keep the peace. But there's one huge problem. How on earth are you supposed to manage all of that by yourself?
And you have to remember, this isn't our modern world with highways and high-speed internet. Medieval Europe was this vast, mostly empty place. It was just filled with wild forests, swamps, and very, very few reliable roads that connected these tiny, isolated villages. Just getting a message from one end of your kingdom to the other, that could take weeks.
Okay, so a king can't be everywhere at once, right? He needed a practical solution, and that solution was feudalism. This wasn't some grand political theory that somebody dreamed up in a library. It was a down-to-earth, pragmatic answer to an absolutely overwhelming problem.
There's this old Dutch saying that just nails the core idea. It basically means if the job is too big for one person, you delegate. And that is exactly what kings like Charlemagne did. They decided to share the burden of ruling.
And this whole system created two key roles. First, you had the lord, or leenheer, who was the one granting the land. Usually this was the king. Then you had the vassal, or leanman. He was a loyal nobleman, a warrior, who received a piece of that land, called a fief, in exchange for his loyalty.
Now, this wasn't some casual handshake deal. Oh no. It was a formal, totally binding contract, and it was sealed with a very solemn oath of loyalty. Both sides had really specific things they had to do for each other. The crucial point here is, this was a two-way street.
So the core of the deal was pretty simple. The vassal owed his lord Rod and Dod, which means counsel and action. Counsel meant giving the king advice, especially in wartime. Action meant, well, grabbing your sword and fighting for him. And in return, the lord's job was to give him the land and, most importantly, to protect his vassal from any attacks. Now here's a really key detail. The original idea, the plan, was that the fief was a loan, not a gift. So when the vassal died, the land was supposed to go right back to the king. Then he could give it to a new, loyal warrior. But, as we're about to see, in theory and in practice, turned out to be two very different things.
And this is where the cracks start to show. This system, which was designed to hold the kingdom together, actually had some unintended consequences that started to pull it apart. The solution began to create its own set of pretty serious problems.
So what happened was a really powerful vassal with a huge chunk of land would start to think, hey, if the king can do it, why can't I? So they would divide up their land and give it to their own vassals, who were called sub-vassals. This created this really complex pyramid of loyalty, where a knight's main allegiance might be to his local lord, not the king way off in the distance.
And this led to a whole cascade of issues. The king's actual power got weaker and weaker as those fiefs started getting passed down from father to son, basically becoming hereditary. And there was very little the king could do about it. The kingdom fractured into this patchwork of semi-independent territories, and pretty soon the king was completely dependent on his powerful vassals to fight any of his wars. You can actually see this decline reflected in the nicknames of the kings who came after the great Charlemagne. You get guys like Louis the Pious, Charles the Bald, and Louis the Stammerer. I mean, these are not exactly names that inspire fear and respect, right? They really show how much the power of the crown was fading.
So, after all that, what are the big things we need to remember about this whole system? Let's quickly recap the most important points to make sure we've got it locked in.
Now, the kings weren't totally helpless, and they did come up with a pretty clever workaround. They started granting huge tracts of land to bishops and other high-ranking clergy. Why? Well, it's simple. Clergy weren't allowed to get married or have kids. So when a bishop died, there was no son to inherit the land. It just automatically went right back to the king. A brilliant move, really.
And just so we're all on the same page, you might hear a few different terms for this. Whether it's called the fief system, feudality, or the feudal system, yep, they all refer to the exact same structure of lords, vassals, and land being granted in exchange for loyalty and military service.
And that brings us to our final thought for today. At the end of the day, feudalism was a trade-off. Vassals give up a huge amount of freedom, but they got land and protection in return. And it leaves us with a question that echoes all the way from the medieval battlefield to our modern world. Is absolute loyalty in exchange for security ever a truly fair deal? Thanks for joining us for this explainer. If you found this useful, you know what to do. Be sure to like, subscribe, and drop a comment with your thoughts below. We'll see you next time.
So picture this. The Roman Empire, this massive continent-spanning superpower, has collapsed. It's gone. And what's left behind is this chaotic patchwork of kingdoms, warlords, and all sorts of different local beliefs. And yet, out of all that chaos, one single faith would rise up and basically define Europe for the next 1,000 years. So let's get into it. How did Christianity not just survive the fall of Rome, but actually go on to conquer a continent?
Right, so this is the big question for our explainer today. How did this actually happen? Because believe me, it was no accident. It was the result of a really powerful organization, a brilliant strategy, and, a very convenient partnership between popes and kings. Let's break it down.
So what was the engine behind this massive expansion? Well, it really came down to one institution that stood in stark contrast to all the political chaos of the time: the highly organized Catholic Church.
See, the church's real power, its secret weapon, was its structure. At the very top, you had the Pope in Rome, seen as the successor to the Apostle Peter. Then, below him, you've got bishops who are in charge of entire regions. And then under them, you have the local priests running the churches in every single town and village. This perfect top-down chain of command meant the church could act with one unified purpose across a totally fractured continent.
Okay, so you have this powerful church and you have these powerful kings. How did they actually interact? How did they get along? Well, this relationship would literally come to define the Middle Ages. Way back in the 5th century, Pope Gelasius came up with this idea that became known as the Two Swords Doctrine. And the concept was pretty simple. The church holds the spiritual sword, it handles everything to do with faith, and the kings, they hold the secular sword. They manage government, law, and justice. Now, they were supposed to stay in their own lanes, but, well, in reality, they worked together a lot. Both of them were aiming for the same goal: a stable, unified, and completely Christian Europe. So, how did the church actually go about spreading its faith across all these different kingdoms? I mean, converting people one by one would take forever. They needed a much smarter, more efficient strategy.
And this is where the missionaries come in. These were dedicated clerics, the real boots on the ground. A lot of them actually traveled from places that had just become Christian, like Britain and Ireland, and they ventured deep into what they called pagan lands on the European mainland. Their whole goal? To convert entire peoples to the faith.
And their strategy? Oh, it was brilliant and incredibly effective. Missionaries didn't waste their time trying to convince every single farmer or blacksmith. Nope, they went straight to the top. Their target was the local king or the chieftain. They understood a very simple truth of human nature. If you can win over the ruler, the people, they will almost always follow.
And this created the ultimate win-win scenario. Think about it. For the church, they get thousands of new followers overnight, plus the military protection of that king's army. And what does the king get in return? Oh, just the ultimate seal of approval, divine legitimacy. His right to rule wasn't just because he was strong, it was because God himself wanted him on the throne. And that is a powerful, powerful tool for unifying your people and crushing any opposition.
But, it wasn't always about friendly persuasion. For really powerful rulers like Charlemagne, the king of the Franks, conversion was also a tool of conquest. After he defeated groups like the Saxons in battle, he would often force them to accept baptism. It basically became a condition of their surrender. This was, quite literally, conversion by the sword.
So we've talked about the popes and kings, the big power players. But there was another force at work, something much quieter, but maybe even more important. A force that was busy preserving the very foundations of civilization, the monasteries. The guiding principle for these places was a simple Latin phrase, ora et labora, which means pray and work. Monks and nuns basically checked out of the chaotic world outside to live in these communities, governed by really strict rules, dedicating their entire lives to God. And from behind those stone walls, their work would end up changing the course of history.
Honestly, you can think of them as the Google of the Middle Ages. I'm serious. In a time when almost everyone was illiterate, and that includes a lot of kings and nobles, monasteries became the only real centers for knowledge and learning. They were the original search engines. So what were they actually doing in there? Well, for one, monks spent countless hours painstakingly copying texts by hand. They preserved not just the Bible, but also the great works of ancient Greece and Rome that would have just disappeared otherwise. Rulers like Charlemagne partnered with them to set up schools, which sparked a whole cultural revival. And because of all this, monasteries became incredibly wealthy, powerful, and were seen as these essential islands of stability in a really volatile world. All right, so fast forward a few centuries. After all this work by missionaries, kings, and monks, Christianity had, for the most part, won. But as it turns out, creating a unified Christendom also created a whole new set of challenges.
By about the year 1000, you could pretty much look at a map of Europe, from Ireland all the way over to Poland, and say, yep, it's Christian. It was a remarkable, truly incredible transformation from the fragmented world that existed back in 500 AD. But, and this is a big but, this new Christian Europe was far from a perfect, unified monolith. Not at all. On the ground level, a lot of the old pagan traditions stuck around for centuries, often just blending in with the new faith. From the outside, the continent was under constant attack from groups like the Vikings. And maybe most damaging of all, a massive crack was forming within the faith itself, a growing divide between the church in Rome and the Eastern Church in Constantinople that would eventually tear Christianity in two. And that really leaves us with this final thought, doesn't it? Was the Christianization of Europe this incredible spiritual triumph, a unifying faith that brought order out of total chaos? Or was it mainly a brilliant tool of political power, used by ambitious popes and kings to build their own empires? The truth, as is so often the case, is probably somewhere right there in the middle. So, what do you think was the most important factor here? Was it the missionaries, the kings, the monasteries? Let us know your thoughts down in the comments. And hey, if you found this explainer helpful, you know the drill. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more. Thanks for watching.